My stepmother abandoned my dying father, leaving her 6-year-old son with me. Now she's returned 3 years later, and she took a gift from me. My parents divorced when I was just 6 years old. My mom and dad argued constantly. It was clear they weren't happy in their marriage, and they took out their frustrations on each other. While it never became physically violent, their loud arguments and verbal abuse left an emotional scar on me. My happy place was school. I loved going there, seeing other kids happily talking about their lives while I dreaded going home. My mom constantly complained to me about how much she hated her life with us. She was a stay-at-home mom who, after finishing all the housework, would sit on the couch for hours watching TV. Looking back, I think my mom was dealing with depression because she barely got up from the couch unless she needed to use the bathroom. She didn't even check if I had eaten lunch after coming back from school. My school was just a block away, and my classmates' mothers would pick us up and drop us off together. My mom stayed on the couch until it was time to cook dinner. Although she tried her best, she wasn't the greatest cook. Sometimes her dishes had too much salt or none at all. As you can imagine, my dad didn't appreciate this any more than I did, which would often start their arguments. If my dad ever brought home takeout, rarely but occasionally, my mom would get furious, saying she could cook better than those dirty restaurant people and accusing him of wasting money. Their arguments escalated into insults, targeting each other's families and insecurities. My dad would call her lazy for sitting on the couch all day, while my mom mocked him for not earning enough. That was pretty much my childhood until they got divorced. I was honestly happy about their divorce and didn't even flinch when they told me over dinner one night. However, my lack of reaction infuriated my mom. She started questioning if I was a psychopath for showing no emotion. When I explained that I did have feelings but was glad they were separating, she began yelling and accusing me of being as selfish as my dad and not caring about her. She vented about how nobody in the family loved or respected her and how she was sick of all of us. Her accusations came out of nowhere, and I couldn't understand what I had done to deserve her wrath. During the divorce process and custody battle, my mom was eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression. After undergoing a psychological evaluation, due to her increasingly frequent mood swings, she was deemed unfit to parent, so my dad was granted full custody. The judge told my parents that if my mom ever got her life together through proper medication and found a job, she might have a chance to regain custody in the future. Until then, I would be solely my dad's responsibility. My dad and I moved to a small apartment near his workplace, much farther from my school, so I had to start taking the school bus. The area wasn't great, and the neighbors were noisy. My dad reassured me that this was only temporary and that he'd take on extra shifts to give me a better life. True to his word, within a year, we moved to a much nicer place. This was when my dad met my stepmother, Stephanie, or Steph, as she liked to be called. Steph seemed wonderful at first. She was our neighbor and had 2 dogs, which I loved because I could play with them whenever she visited my dad. Day by day, I saw her and my dad grow closer. During this time, she was respectful toward me and mostly stayed out of my way. However, things changed when she started staying overnight. Suddenly, she had issues with me watching TV after finishing my homework, not helping my dad with the dishes, or not cooking my meals. You have to understand, I was only 8 years old at the time. I get that kids should be taught independence early, but 8 felt too young. I could barely reach the kitchen counter, but she forced me to wash my dishes and yelled if I forgot. I wish my dad had seen the red flags and ended things with her, but he seemed smitten, maybe because he had been lonely for so long. When Steph finally moved in with all her dogs, she demanded that I give up my bedroom so her dogs could have a space of their own. My dad and I were shocked that she would even suggest such a thing. My dad tried reasoning with her, saying it was my room and the dogs could easily stay in the living room or even her bedroom. But Steph insisted that her dogs needed their own space, as she had always given them an entire room. She even suggested that I move into the closet under the stairs, saying it would be fun. I threw a tantrum and cried, terrified of living in that dark space. This led to a heated argument between my dad and Steph, where she threatened to move out. My dad stood his ground, calling her demand ridiculous, and they eventually compromised when he proposed building a doghouse in the backyard. Steph agreed but was clearly angry at me for not giving in to her demands. After that, she wouldn't let me play with her dogs anymore, and yelled at me even if the dogs came near me. I noticed that after moving in, Steph quit her job. I don't know if she and my dad ever discussed it, but she never resumed working once she started living with us. This left her with too much free time to nitpick at me or find reasons to complain. I felt like she saw me as an unwanted obstacle in my dad's life. She constantly asked why my mother had abandoned me, or why I couldn't just live with my mom instead. My mother hadn't contacted me even once since their divorce, nor did she show any interest in getting in touch with me. Steph began finding more and more reasons to complain about me to my dad, She had issues if I didn't clean my room to her standards or if I stayed out a little late with my neighborhood friends during the weekend. Whenever my dad and I went to watch a Disney movie, because he knew how much I loved them, she would tag along but then try to convince my dad to buy tickets for another movie at the box office. My dad never did, which I guess annoyed her even more. If you're wondering why my dad was with a woman like her, it's because, apart from their arguments about me, Steph and my dad had a loving relationship. They were quite a solid couple, but I don't know what it was about me that made her so angry. By the time I turned 11, according to Steph, I was too quiet and introverted for my age. She constantly complained about how it embarrassed her that I wasn't a popular kid at school. She would then go on about how popular she used to be as a cheerleader. Steph also had a problem with me sleeping in too much on weekends and not helping enough around the house. I genuinely tried to make an effort whenever I could. I set alarms to wake up earlier so I could get ready for school on time, or wake up early on weekends to help wash dishes, walk her dogs, or literally help with anything she wanted. However, no matter what I did, there was always something to criticize about me. Her negative words started affecting me so much that I began feeling anxious around her for no reason. To give you an idea of how much it affected me during the worst of my anxiety, the critical voice in my head sounded just like hers. It was that bad. For years, she once accused me of being selfish because I ate too much food during a family event. Steph had invited her parents and family over for a barbecue. I had just come home after playing basketball with my friends, and like any other teenager, I was probably starving. She pulled me aside and told me it was selfish of me to eat so much food when it wasn't meant for me in the first place. I pointed out that my dad had bought all the food, but she angrily whispered that I was being a bad stepdaughter and shouldn't embarrass her in front of her family by eating too much. As I grew older, Steph would assign me more and more chores, even if I had spent all day doing homework and was exhausted. She expected me to cook for the three of us every Wednesday and assigned me daily tasks like taking out the trash and cleaning the stove. Even if I did what she wanted, it was never good enough because she would complain to my dad about my cleaning habits, saying I didn't clean the way she liked or didn't know how. Yet, when it came to her cleaning, she overlooked any issues. When I started taking swimming lessons, she pointed out how I was wasting my dad's money and that I was a spoiled child. She told my dad that the money could be better spent on something else. Once, when her dogs got sick, she asked my dad to pay for their treatment, telling him that if he could pay for my stupid swimming lessons, then he could also pay the vet bill for her dogs. My dad refused, and she had to borrow money from her parents. Eventually, when I turned 13, my dad and Steph informed me they were expecting a baby. This came as a shock to me, but they seemed deliriously happy. My dad told me how Steph had proposed to him, and that they would get married before the baby arrived because it was the right thing to do. I remember feeling numb because I hated this decision and wanted to yell at my dad for getting into another horrible marriage. However, he and Steph were adults who made this decision. What could I do as a 13-year-old? My dad and Steph had a quick courthouse wedding where her parents and I were present as witnesses. For their honeymoon, Steph insisted my dad take her to Lake Tahoe, so I stayed with her parents for a week. Steph's parents were just as unpleasant as she was. They asked me invasive questions about my mother, then commented on how maybe I was just as flawed as my mom because of her mental illness, and how I should feel lucky that Steph decided to marry my dad, despite him having a daughter like me. Somehow they made me feel inferior, as if I had no worth. In the months that followed, Steph gave birth to a baby boy. From the moment I laid eyes on Paul, he has always been my brother. I never felt any animosity or resentment toward him for being an only child before. I had been alone for so long that having a sibling felt comforting. Paul was born premature. My dad told me how he had colic, so sometimes he cried all night. Dad took care of Paul through the night and only slept in the early hours of the morning. And then Steph took over when I came home from school. Steph would leave her baby with me and ask me to feed or change his diaper if he started crying. I know my dad and Steph were exhausted, but she treated me like a babysitter and expected me to spend time taking care of her baby, even if I had homework to finish or friends to hang out with. If I made plans with my friends to watch a movie or go hiking, she would scold me for being selfish and not helping the family. However, my dad never treated me that way. In fact, he encouraged me to live my life as normally as I did. Once, when my dad went on a work trip for 3 days, my situation with Steph worsened. She expected me to take care of Paul, even at night, and would yell at me if he cried too much. She told me how, as a woman, I needed to learn to take care of a baby, otherwise no man would want to marry me. She taught me how to warm milk for him, check the bottle's temperature, burp him, and bathe him. If Paul cried, she would shout at me to go see him, as if I were his mother and not her. When Dad came back home, I broke down and told him everything because I was tired of working so much and was exhausted. He and Steph had a screaming argument, And he warned her not to take advantage of me and that if she felt tired, then he could help her more. She didn't like that and told my dad she didn't enjoy being a mother and that this journey wasn't for her. She packed her bags and left. My dad spent weeks begging and pleading for her to come back because he had to take leave from work to take care of Paul. Steph's parents also scolded my dad for standing up for me. They told him how every family expects the older daughter to help the mothers with the younger one, and that this is just tradition. I don't know, maybe my dad got tired or just decided to shut his mouth because he felt helpless. But when Steph finally decided to come back, he didn't care anymore if she expected me to take care of Paul. She started making Paul sleep next to me so that she wouldn't be disturbed at night. If I had plans with friends, she forced me to cancel them or threatened to take away my phone. When Paul started crawling, she expected me to childproof my room so her son wouldn't get hurt. I think that was the first time I began resenting my dad in all this. He no longer stood up for me and let everything happen just to save his marriage. He knew I purposely stayed out late to avoid having to complain to him about Steph. Steph also went out drinking with her friends at the bar and came home drunk, passing out before she could even make it to the bedroom. I knew I had to work hard to leave this house behind if I ever wanted any independence, so that's exactly what I did. I put my head down and studied. I made sure my grades were excellent and secretly researched universities far from home. When I finally got into a good university with scholarships, I informed my dad. He was proud that I had accomplished everything on my own, but Steph wasn't. She accused me of deliberately applying to a university miles away. I didn't fight the accusations, so she started yelling at me, saying I needed to find a nearby university, and that family came before my education. I refused and moved into my university dorm. After that, my contact with Steph and my dad significantly reduced. Steph stopped speaking to me entirely because she didn't like that I left and wasn't helping with Paul, while my dad was tired of being the mediator between us. I focused on my studies and made new friends. In my second year of university, one afternoon, my dad called me 23 times. I was with my friends, and my phone was on silent, so I didn't notice. However, when I got home, I immediately called him back, and my dad answered the call, with lots of shouting and glass breaking in the background. I asked him if he was okay, and he sounded choked up. Worried, I asked if something had happened, and that's when my dad told me he had stomach cancer. When I got to my dad's house, I found out that Steph had really left him. But that wasn't all. She had left Paul with my dad. Imagine leaving your child in the hands of your dying husband. I felt so bad for Paul as he looked terrified. I hugged him and offered him some cookies while I spoke to my dad. He kept repeating over and over that Steph had said she didn't want to be with a dying man. But what enraged me was that she left her 6-year-old son like he was nothing. I knew exactly what it felt like to be a 6-year-old with your life turned completely upside down. I couldn't understand why Steph hadn't taken Paul with her if she was really leaving my dad just because he had cancer. Something didn't add up, and I felt it had more to do with the fact that she didn't enjoy being a mom and now had an easy excuse to abandon her son. I tried contacting her and her parents several times, but no one answered my calls. I could have driven over to see them in person, but I didn't want to waste the precious time I had with my dad. I wanted to spend time with him, and honestly, I also loved spending time with Paul. I cared for my dad and Paul, and this went on for a few weeks. I accompanied my dad to all his appointments as he went through chemotherapy. Since I had to return to university, I decided to admit my dad to a cancer treatment center as he needed to be monitored 24/7. I had no choice but to take Paul to Steph's parents' house, as I didn't know what else to do. When they opened the door, they were shocked to see me standing there with Paul and asked what I was doing there. I was so angry that I confronted them about their daughter simply running away, leaving Paul and my dad without giving any reason. Her parents were very reluctant to tell me anything, but I kept yelling at them, and that's when Steph finally decided to come out of her room. I was shocked that this woman had been living right here, while ignoring all my calls. Steph asked me to stop yelling at her parents and threatened to call the police. I swear if Paul hadn't been there at that moment, I would have lunged at Steph and punched her right then and there. I told her that I honestly didn't care about her reasons for leaving my dad, but she needed to take care of her son. Steph started refusing, telling me how Paul was my brother, so I should take responsibility since I was already there taking care of my dad. I took a deep breath just to calm myself down and told her that my dad was admitted to a cancer treatment center and that I was going back to university. So unless she wanted me to call social services, Paul would stay with her. I kissed Paul goodbye and my heart broke for him, but I had no other choice at that moment. I tried my best to focus on my studies as much as I could because I hoped to get a good job so I could support my dad if he recovered, and Paul if the situation arose. It's hard for me to write this, but unfortunately, my dad didn't survive much longer. We talked every day, and he told me how he was improving, but he clearly wasn't. Through all this, Steph never reached out to him or even allowed Paul to visit his dad. I tried calling her, but as usual, she ignored my calls like I was nothing to her. 2 months later, the doctors informed me that he had passed away in his sleep in the early hours of the morning. I had to return home and make all the arrangements for his funeral. For the first time in my life, I felt alone and like I had no one. During my dad's funeral, Paul came with Steph's parents, with Steph nowhere in sight. He saw me and ran to hug me. I broke down on his small shoulders because he was literally all I had left in this world to call family. After the funeral, Steph's parents informed me that Steph had decided to leave that morning. I asked what they meant, and they told me they had found out in recent months that Steph had been having an affair with one of her ex-boyfriends the entire time she was married to my dad. Her parents explained that she had wanted to leave my dad for a long time after realizing motherhood wasn't for her, but she was stalling, and now that he finally had cancer, she found a reason to leave. I asked why they were telling me all this when they should have asked Steph to stop, but her parents continued, saying that since Steph didn't want Paul, they wanted me to adopt him. I stared at them for a second because my mind was confused while I was still going through the grief of losing my dad. They tried to apologize and assure me that they could care for Paul as long as he needed, but since they were too old and had health problems, they couldn't look after him full-time, so they wanted me to adopt him. Initially, I refused and told them we had to call the police and social services right then and there, but they informed me that even if social services were called, they couldn't do much, and Paul might end up in the system. They tried to guilt-trip me, saying I was all he had left, and that I was the only one who could help him. Maybe it was because I had just lost the only family member I had, but I knew in my heart that I couldn't abandon him. So, on the day I lost my dad, I realized I would have to start taking care of my half-brother. I wish I could say it was easy, but it wasn't. I had to take a gap year from university because there was no way I could manage everything alongside my studies. My professors were really disappointed because I was an outstanding student, but they all understood my situation. Fortunately for us, my dad had left everything in my name, so I worked on selling his house and car to provide the resources I needed to support both Paul and myself. I wanted to leave this town behind and planned to take Paul with me. He was sad about leaving his friends behind, but he was also excited about moving to a new city with me. Paul trusted me implicitly and knew I would take care of him no matter what. Steph's parents didn't mind us leaving the city. Paul and I lived in a small rented apartment near my university campus, and I enrolled him in a nearby school. I wish I could say the next 3 years were easy, but they weren't. For the next 3 years, I balanced my responsibilities as a university student and Paul's caretaker. It was hard juggling studies, work, and parenting, but seeing Paul thrive and grow made it all worthwhile. I also applied for legal guardianship of him since his mother had clearly abandoned him, and his grandparents were not in good health. There was no doubt I would become his legal guardian. I had done everything in my power to care for him, so it was a natural transition for me to officially take on that role. The process wasn't easy, involving paperwork and legal consultations, but I was determined to go through it all for Paul. In the end, I was granted legal guardianship. Despite all the challenges, our little apartment slowly began to feel like home. Paul adapted well to his new school, made friends, and excelled academically. I kept working hard, knowing that every effort I made was for Paul's future. Over time, I landed a good job after graduation, which allowed us to move to a better neighborhood in the city. Paul has grown into a confident and happy child, and I couldn't be prouder of the young man he's becoming. He remembers Steph and occasionally mentions her, but he also understands that I am his real family. We talk about Dad all the time because I want Paul to remember him. About a week ago, I received a call from Steph's parents. Occasionally, they check in on Paul every few months, so I didn't think much of it when I answered. To my surprise, it was Steph on the line. She started asking me where I was and why I sold Dad's house. She demanded to know where I lived and if Paul was with me. I told her that Paul was living with me because I would never have abandoned him like she did, and that she couldn't come near him. Steph began saying that she knew I was Paul's legal guardian, but that didn't mean she, as his biological mother, didn't have the right to know where he was. She threatened to go to the police if I didn't tell her. I laughed when I heard this and calmly explained to her that she was free to do whatever she wanted, but since I had been court-appointed to care for Paul, I wouldn't hesitate to file a restraining order against her. I told her she was the worst mother in the world for abandoning her own child, and that she was lucky I loved Paul enough to step in. Otherwise, who knows where he would be now. Steph's voice cracked, and she started crying. She told me she was sorry for what she did but was also grieving and I shouldn't blame her. I asked her not to call me again since neither Paul nor I wanted anything to do with her, and I hung up. After the call, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and relief. Anger towards Steph for causing so much pain and disruption in our lives, sadness for the loss of my dad and the struggles we faced, and relief that Paul and I had managed to overcome these challenges together. However, since then, I felt a bit guilty and have wondered if others have gone through similar situations and what they've done in such circumstances. Am I the bad person for keeping Paul away from his biological mother? Update 1. When I posted this, I didn't expect to receive thousands of comments. Thank you to everyone for sharing your suggestions and feedback. It has been heartwarming to hear from so many others who, like me, are older siblings and have faced similar challenges. Your stories have made me feel understood, and I appreciate each of you for reaching out. I've listened to all of you, and I'm glad that most agree I should keep Paul away from Steph. I'll also start documenting our conversations in case she decides to go to the police, or if any conflict arises. Although I know she has no legal grounds, I also had a conversation with Paul about his mother contacting me. I was honest, and told him how Steph had called asking about him, and that if he wanted, he could talk to her. But Paul refused. He told me he understood why I had kept him away from Steph and didn't want any contact with her. He said he felt loved and cared for by me, and that was all he needed. I respected Paul's decision and assured him I would continue prioritizing his well-being above all else. I also made sure to reassure him that he wasn't at fault for Steph's actions and that he deserved all the love and happiness in the world. Update 2. Apologies for the delay in the update. Many of you have been asking for one, so here it is. This is the email I sent to Steph and her parents about Paul, as some of you advised me to do. Subject: regarding Paul's welfare. Hi Steph. I'm writing to update you on Paul's well-being and current living situation since you called on date. As you know, I was appointed Paul's legal guardian, having taken care of him for the past 3 years since you abandoned him and your parents declined to take responsibility. I have taken on the responsibility of providing for Paul and ensuring his safety and happiness. Paul is currently living with me in City, where I have enrolled him in a nearby school. He is thriving academically and socially, making friends and adjusting well to his new environment. I want to assure you that Paul is in good hands and receiving the care and attention he deserves. I understand that you may have concerns or questions about Paul's upbringing. However, since you chose to leave his life the day our father passed away without giving any explanation, I believe you have forfeited the right to request any updates. I am open to maintaining communication with his grandparents only for Paul's sake, as I must prioritize his safety and stability above all else. Therefore, I hope you will no longer disturb us. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. I hope that after this email, Steph leaves Paul and me alone. Update 3. It has been 6 months since my last update, and I want to assure everyone that Paul is still with me. As expected, Steph never did anything after my email, and her parents called to inform me that she had left again. They also filled me in on why she had called out of the blue. It turns out the ex-boyfriend she left us for had broken up with her and is now engaged to someone else. So, being Steph, she thought it would be completely acceptable to come back into our lives and act like nothing had happened. Her parents assured me that Steph would never take legal action since she had abandoned her own child, and they were also fed up with her behavior. They assured me they would support my decision and stay in touch to check on Paul's well-being. By the way, Paul is doing well in school. He recently celebrated his birthday with his friends and has started learning to skate. I've been working hard to provide for us and ensure Paul has everything he needs to grow and succeed in his future. It's not always easy, but seeing Paul's smile and hearing his laughter makes every challenge I face worthwhile. Update 4. Recently, something unexpected happened with Stephanie that I want to share with you all. It turns out that during one of her attempts to re-enter our lives, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I don't know how she found out where we lived, but there she was. I wasn't home at the time, but Paul was. So when Stephanie knocked on the door, he didn't open it. However, Paul immediately called me to inform me about Stephanie's visit. I decided to head home immediately. When I arrived, Stephanie was trying to persuade Paul to let her in, but he was firmly refusing. I decided to confront Stephanie and reminded her of her previous abandonment. I told her she had no right to suddenly show up and expect to be welcomed after everything she had done. Stephanie tried to apologize and make excuses, but I'd had enough. That's when I remembered all the times Stephanie had humiliated and belittled me, all the times she made me feel small and insignificant. I realized it was time to put an end to her interference in our lives. I made a decision. I called the police and reported Stephanie. When they arrived, I explained the situation and showed them all the documents proving my legal custody of Paul. The officer spoke to Stephanie and warned her about the legal consequences of her behavior. She wasn't too happy about that and started arguing and insulting me. Finally, the police took her away. I'm not sure if they detained her or just removed her from the premises. Hopefully, she won't come back. But if she does, I will take legal action. I should also add that while she was at my door arguing, she brought up my father's house. According to her, she was entitled to money from the sale because she had been his wife. I found that laughable since she had been unfaithful and abandoned him when he was dying. So no, she's not getting anything from that. At that moment, I wanted to hit her in the face because her attitude reminded me of how she had been all those years ago. But I didn't want to do it in front of Paul, nor did I want to add more conflict to this drama. Although I hope she doesn't tempt me further because I am definitely a bit exhausted with her. I know some will say I should file a restraining order right now, but if I do, I'd miss the opportunity for a bit of revenge. Update 5. As expected, she came back. It seems the incident with the police wasn't enough for her. Luckily, Paul was at a friend's house this time, so it was just the two of us. As many of you suggested in earlier comments, the only reason she came was for money from the sale of my father's house. This sparked a heated argument, and when she said I was just as crazy as my mother and that my father got cancer from having to take care of me because I was a bad daughter, I just saw red, as they say. So I slapped her. At that moment, Stephanie was standing at my door with one foot already inside. After slapping her, I pushed her outside and shut the door. Now I've contacted a lawyer, and we're filing the restraining order. I don't know if the slap will help my case, but it felt so good.